Joining me at the campfire today is Marianne Porter. Marianne is associate professor at the Florida Atlantic University, where she runs the Florida Atlantic Biomechanics Laboratory, also known as the Fab Lab. Much better name.
Yeah.
There, she works on biomechanics and functional morphology. Now, by looking at the properties of biological materials such as cartilage and bone, and what organisms use those materials for, such as for swimming or feeding, she helps us to understand how organisms like sharks and fish work. And she uses that information to develop new bio-inspired materials and also robot fish. Marianne, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. That was probably one of the best summaries of my research that anyone's ever done.
Yay, I hit it right there. Well,
Yeah, great.
if people know your research, they're going to want me to ask this question. So I'm sorry, we have to get it out of the way. People will want to know this one from you, right? So how close are you to building robot sharks with friggin' laser beams on their heads? That's
I'm personally not very close at all. We have been focusing a lot of our time recently, more on like CT scans and actual swimming fish. So the attachment of laser beams to the robot sharks is far away in my lab, but I think there are some other labs that are actually pretty close to that. So, watch out, world.
well, I think there's some good Dr. Evil funding that way if you want it.
As long as I can have my cat with me to do all this research, Mr. What is it? Bigglesworth?
Well,
That'd
yeah,
be good.
Awesome. No, that was of course a silly question, but I know you make these awesome robot fish, and I really like the work you've done. And congratulations with your new paper on how, well, cartilaginous fish, I shouldn't call them fish, chondrichthyus, smell underwater.
They're
That
fish.
was a very nice one. But you didn't start with fish. I think you started with plants. So can you tell us a little bit how you got started?
Yeah, so I actually started out my life as a biologist, as a scientist, even as a plant ecologist. And so one of my favorite stories to tell is about how I got started as a scientist, because it remains still something that I think about every day, and it definitely got me started on my journey. So
Mhm.
this is a story for all the young scientists out there who are just beginning their careers and just beginning sort of their paths forward as a scientist. And so way back, like nearly 30 years ago now, I think, if I have to do that head math real quick, I was an undergraduate student
Mhm.
at Northern Arizona University. So that's something everybody always asks me too, is like, oh, you must have grown up near the ocean because you study sharks. I'm actually from Arizona in the United States. Um, I assume your podcast viewership is variable around
Yeah,
our lovely planet.
very
Um,
few sharks there.
Exactly. So Arizona, it's a desert, and there's actually a really big pine forest in northern Arizona. And so I was a student at Northern Arizona University, and I was majoring in zoology. So I was working towards my
Hmm.
zoology degree, and I had wanted to be a scientist, but I didn't know how to do that. I had read a lot of National Geographics and watched all the nature shows, and I knew I love science and wanted to be a scientist, but I didn't know how. Like, how does
Uh-huh.
one do that aside from picking a major or a degree in the sciences? And so I was taking one of my classes. It was actually my ecology class, and I loved my professor. It was Dr. Tom Whittam, who was at Northern Arizona for a very long time. He was a brilliant plant ecologist.
Mhm.
And I was loving my class so much that I went to talk to him in office hours, which I'd never gone to office hours before because I didn't even know what they were. So, also for all the students watching, especially in the United States, professors have office hours, which is a time where you can go ask them questions about their research, the class, whatever. It's time that professors have to give to students outside of the classroom time. FYI.
Important. Yes.
Anyway, so I went to office hours, and Dr. Whittam was like, hey, you're getting an A in my class and you seem really interested in this. Would you like to do research?
Mhm.
And do research in my lab with one of my grad students? And I was like, that sounds amazing. I don't know anything about what this means. And so he was describing a project where we would be working in the pinyon pine forest, where he
Mhm.
had a whole bunch of his research for literally decades. And we would be looking at a moth, which is a keystone species in that system. And so this moth is really important because it is a cone boring moth. So it
Oh,
eats all the cones off of pine
right.
trees.
Yeah.
The cones hold seeds, right? So if you are destroying all the cones and the seeds, you are basically taking away the pine tree's ability to reproduce. So these moths are like changing the whole ecosystem.
And is that a
And
moth that belongs, is that in equilibrium with those trees? It's been there
yeah,
forever, or is that
it's
an
a
introduced species?
yeah, it's a native moth.
Okay.
It just lives there. And the system, he knows so much about it because he studied it for literal decades. There's actually other things going on, several other insects that are really important in that system. But I was focused on the moths. And what
Mhm.
was really important for me is that gave me my very first field experience. So I got to learn what it was to be a field biologist and go out in the field. So I learned about waking up early to go out in the field even if it was snowing, even if it was hot.
Mm.
Um, we would go out, we would count the moths, we would measure the trees. So I had a lot of sap in my hair and all over my body because I had to get
Yeah, yeah.
all up in these pine trees to, get the moths, measure the trees.
Mhm.
And what was really great about this experience is I learned some really sort of overarching lessons in science that, again, really do stick with me today. And so one of the things Dr. Whittam always used to ask us is, well, what is the question? What is
Mm.
the actual question you're trying to answer? Which is something I have to ask myself all the time because you start going down rabbit holes in your data
Yeah.
and you're like, oh, there's this and this and this. But it's really important to step back and think about, what am I trying to answer? What are my data actually telling me? And so that's a really great overarching theme that I ask myself all the time. And I teach my
Yeah.
students when they come in and
Mm.
they're sort of spinning out of control in space, as it were. Like, what is the question? Like, what are we trying to accomplish here? Um, and it was something that, being out in the field, you really observe and have to think about what your questions are. So you're really
Mhm.
working on that sort of very first steps of the scientific method, right? Like, what are your observations? And then developing those questions and hypotheses. And so
And then
that
sometimes
was
finding out that you're not asking the right question, right?
is huge. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or you realize after you've done an experiment in the lab that you did an experiment that doesn't answer your question and you realize you have to do it all again,
Oh
right?
dear, yeah.
You're like, oh, turns out that didn't quite work out the way I expected it to. But that's like science and the scientific method, right? You've got to
Mhm.
keep 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 moving forward and sometimes do it over. And so the what is the question was a huge lesson I learned from this and being out and about with the trees in the snow and the sun. The other thing that I really learned from those experiences is if you're trying to observe something and make those initial observations,
Uh-huh.
sometimes it really helps to look at the extremes. And
Mm.
so that's where going out in the snow turns out to be really important. What does it look like in winter? What does it look like in summer? If you're looking at something in sort of different elevations, what happens at the highest elevation and the lowest elevation?
Right.
What happens at different points in the trees? So really looking at extremes in your system and what you're trying to study and in
Hmm.
nature is huge. And you can do that anywhere, right? Walking around your neighborhood, you see a bird you've never seen before. That's like an extreme. That's something that's different. Like, what's
Yeah.
going on there? Where was that bird? Or, you can do it anywhere. Walking around our campus, we have raccoons that are very bold and are out during the day, which is not
Hmm.
what raccoons usually do. So I'm like, that's an extreme behavior. Like, you are
That's
very
interesting.
habituated to humans. And, so we kind of look for that. And it's actually turned out to be, again, another important theme and lesson that I've carried throughout my career, looking at extremes. So a lot of my papers are on the weird sharks or the sharks doing weird things. You
Mm.
mentioned the sharks that get out of the water and walk. So how do they do that? What do they do? So that's like a pretty extreme behavior for a
Yeah.
fish to leave the water and wander around. And we just had a paper come out where we were looking at how the vertebral columns, the spines of
Mhm.
thresher sharks, are mineralized.
Yeah.
Thinking about how does that sort of help us tell the story about why and how thresher sharks use that giant tail to
Yeah, they're
whip the tail
beautiful
over their
sharks.
heads,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And then I've also done a number of studies on hammerheads.
Okay.
So got the hammerheads with the weird head that sticks out to the side, very different than basically any shark or any fish or any organism you will look at. And
Yeah.
so sort of looking at those extremes to kind of understand your system. So those are sort of my like big life lessons that I have gotten from the very beginning of my career that actually still stick out. And
Hmm.
you know, I like to remember my life as a plant ecologist and also use it as an opportunity to remind students and early career scientists that your questions and the skills you're learning are huge. So I often have students who want to talk to me about, well, how do I study sharks? I'm like, well, first you have to become a scientist. And so
Yeah.
look for opportunities that are going to help you learn how to become a scientist. And those were all very important things I learned from the trees and the moths in northern Arizona.
Yeah, you really learn to look at nature in a very different way, right? So,
Right.
I mean, other people would just be annoyed by the raccoons during the daytime, and you think about, oh, wait a minute, there's something going on. Yeah.
There is something going on. They like to steal the lunches that the students throw into the trash and leave behind. So it
Ah,
makes a
that's it.
lot of sense to be out
Mm,
during the day on a
yeah.
college campus, on a university campus. There are far more snacks available,
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Now
but
how
they
to
do
prove it.
walk around campus, kind of like you would see cats or dogs walking around a normal place. They just like
Oh, that's good.
are around.
I like raccoons. They're badass.
They're pretty wild.
Amazing. And you don't need to drop yourself in the middle of the ocean and chase sharks to be a scientist. You can just look at
Exactly.
moths or raccoons or anything in your backyard.
Any
Right?
any place you can make an observation about something weird,
Yeah,
that's
there are
like a
things to
good
be
place
discovered
to
there,
ask a
right?
question. Yeah.
But you did transition to sharks at some point.
I did. During my PhD, I had an opportunity to start working in Adam Summers' lab where he was working on biomechanics. That's how we met, um,
Yes.
way back in the day in California. And so um, this gave me a real opportunity to take some of those life lessons I learned on how to be
Hmm.
a scientist and start working in a system and the kind of science that was dramatically different from anything I had been trained to do as a field ecologist up until
Yeah,
that point. And
because
so,
biomechanics and ecology are very far apart, pretty much.
especially organismal biomechanics and plant ecology, like
Yeah.
it's real different. But again, like I had those big questions and sort of skills as a scientist that I was able to take advantage of as I started my academic journey as a biomechanist and shark scientist. And that has led me to some really exciting places. And I wanted to share a couple of stories with you
Yes,
about
please.
a few of the sort of things that had happened along the way. These are a little bit less academic, sort of things that happened to me underwater while scuba diving. Again, it's those observational skills that are going to be important here,
Hmm.
right? Um, so the first story I want to tell you about was
Sure.
one of my wildest scuba dives ever. Actually, this is my next two stories or
You've
two.
scuba dived in a lot of places in the world, I imagine by
I
now.
have been able to, I have been lucky enough to be able to go a lot of places. Um, Again, those observational skills are huge, right? Seeing what an animal does underwater gives me a ton of ideas of things that I want to explore, look at
Hmm.
in my lab, and helping me think about what those next questions are, right? It's that observation, like what is the question? What's happening here that I can look at and again the extremes, like you're out underwater and you see this extreme thing happen. You're like, oh,
Wow.
What should I do with that?
So you need to get
So
out there. You need to
yeah,
observe
get
your
out there.
organism. Yeah.
But I will add as sort of an accessibility thing, you don't have to be a scuba diver to be a marine biologist or study sharks.
Oh.
Most of my research does not require me to scuba dive. It's what I do for fun. Like I said, it's where I get my inspiration and ideas. So it
Hmm.
does definitely help me for my work, but is not a requirement. The ocean is huge and it has a million different questions and organisms for people to look at and explore. So there's
Yeah.
a lot of opportunities there. But I want to tell you about one of the really interesting sort of field adventures I had in
Sure.
Hawaii, on the Big Island of Hawaii.
Okay.
Um, I was diving at a place called Huaco, which is a pretty popular and well-known dive site.
Is that from a
And
boat or from the shore or?
from the shore.
Okay.
And so you drive to this little place, you get out, and the dive shop had told us, this is where a sea turtle cleaning station is. And
Hmm.
that's always fun. So what a sea turtle cleaning station is the sea turtles kind of swim by a particular area and a bunch of fish come up and start cleaning the algae off of them.
Yeah.
So this happens in a lot of animals, and the people at the dive shop had said, oh, there was a sea turtle cleaning station there yesterday, like you should go out there and check it out. So we're like,
Hmm.
okay, cool. And this is Hawaii, so a lot of volcanic activity historically, currently, and as a result, there are a bunch of places. You've got these little caves, like tunnels you can swim through,
Hmm.
um, arches you can swim through. So it's a really great coral. It's a really great place to see a lot of structure when you scuba
I
dive.
imagine. Yeah.
So I go out and I'm looking for the turtles and their cleaning station with my dive buddy. And here's the reason I think this is an interesting story. The cleaning station was really neat. We were able to watch the turtles and all
Okay.
the fish
Cool.
carefully picking all the algae off.
Hmm.
Then I heard the weirdest thing I've heard in my entire life. This is why the story I think is interesting.
Hmm.
You're underwater, so sound travels really far and really well.
Yeah.
If you're underwater, you can hear people rattling chains. So that's a way divers get other people's attention. You can hear boats going by. You can hear a lot of stuff underwater because sound is going to travel so well.
Yeah.
I heard this noise that was the weirdest thing I have ever heard above
Okay.
water and underwater. And it was like all encompassing. And I was
Oh,
like,
scary.
it was scary. And there were big boats around. And so I was like looking at my dive buddy. I was like, what is that? They're
Hmm.
like, ah. And my dive buddy was completely unconcerned about this super weird, and it lasted a couple of seconds, sound
Okay.
that we had heard. And he was like, I don't know, boat?
Yeah.
I'm like, I don't think that was a boat. Like, there is no way that was a boat.
Okay.
And so
Hmm.
I had lived in California for a long time. We were in Hawaii. These are both places where earthquakes are a common thing. So
Mm.
I'm like thinking about what is this? Like, this noise was all around me. Like, I could feel it. It was weird.
Ah.
And so I was like, I think that there was just an earthquake. So then my thought is, oh, that's when tsunamis happen. Like,
Yeah.
perhaps we should go. And my dive buddy like looks at their air supply and they're like, no, we're good. Like, let's keep going. Like, are you okay? I'm like, yeah, I'm okay, but I think we should go up. And they're like, oh no, like, let's go. So then I'm like, okay, fine. Like, hopefully there's no tsunami coming. Like,
Wow. Okay.
it's fine.
Yeah, it's hard to communicate underwater, right? I mean,
It's
you can't
true.
just say it.
And so I was like looking at the time, I'm like, okay, we've got like maybe 5 more minutes of this dive anyway, like whatever. So we're like going around. My dive buddy is swimming under the arches. I'm thinking if that was an earthquake, like this stuff might all move. Like that's a bad idea. So I'm like pulling them backwards and they're like going in because they want to take a picture and I'm pulling them out. Anyway, I'm still thinking and like gesturing like we should go up.
Yeah.
So finally they're like, okay, let's go. But they're like pointing at their air gauge, really annoyed, like,
Yeah.
I've still got tons of air. You've still got tons of air. Like, what is your deal? And I'm like, no, let's go.
There's
And
no
so
hand gesture for
for
earthquake, right?
earthquake, it is more like you listen to me. We're
Yeah.
going up. So when you start getting more dramatic with your gestures, your dive buddy is going to listen to you. I was like,
Hmm.
stop it, let's go. And so we get out of the water and there's no one on the beach. There were people on the beach when we got into the water. So it was
Oh,
like,
that's weird.
yeah, I was like, well, okay. But you know, I have not been in a tsunami, but I assume there are sirens or some sort of communication happening. It was totally silent.
Huh.
So I'm kind of like, okay. And then we're driving back up the hill to the dive store anyway. So we get in the car and I'm like, did you hear that? I think it was an earthquake. And they're like, no, it was a big boat. I'm like, that was not a boat. Like I
Huh.
said, the absolute weirdest noise I've ever heard in my entire life. So then we were able to drive up to the dive store
Yeah.
and they were like, oh, did you guys feel the earthquake? And I was like, see, I'm like, we were underwater during the earthquake. And the
Wow,
people
that
at the
is
dive
one of the
were like,
rarest experience a person can have. I mean, being
so
underwater with an
weird.
earthquake. Can
Right.
you?
And so
Wow.
it was wild. They were like, "Oh no, there was an earthquake." And I
Uh-huh.
was like, "See, I told you we should have gotten out." And I'm like, "Do we need to worry about tsunamis?" Like living in California, I'm like, I earthquakes happen. It's something
Yeah.
a little scary in the moment, but you know, it happens and most of the time it's like fine. And so they're like, "Oh no, there's no tsunami warning, you're fine." I'm like, "Okay." But then
Hmm.
to my dive buddy, I was like, "See, I told you so. Like you've got to listen to me." Um, but then our next stop was to go hiking in Volcanoes National Park. And by the volcano, they have all the earthquake activity like
Mm.
in one of their visitor centers. So we were actually able to go back and look at the seismic
Yeah.
activity at the time of our dive and like
Okay.
see the earthquake on all the instruments. But
Eh,
that was I think probably one of the wildest field
ah,
adventures I
no, but
ever had.
that's a super rare, weird experience. Can you describe what it sounded like or what it felt like? I mean, did the water also shake, or did you not feel it in the water?
I didn't feel it in the water, but it was like an all-encompassing sound. Like it felt
Huh.
like it was vibrating my body, but also like, you know, when you hear a boat go by underwater, it's got a direction.
Yeah.
Like there's a directionality to it. Like if someone shakes a chain underwater as a diver to get attention of other divers, you can tell which direction it is, so you know which direction to look and you can see like the person and be like, "Oh, okay." You
Yeah.
know where the boat is. This was like literally surrounding in all
Huh.
directions. And I was like, okay, like where did that come from? And I was looking like, is there a giant boat here? Like we're pretty close to shore. I don't, but yeah, it was
Wow.
wild. And then I was looking, I'm like, the sea turtles at this cleaning station had long since gone away. I'm like, are the animals doing anything weird? Do I need to like,
Mm, yeah,
what's
they
going
usually
on
know,
here?
right? They
Yeah,
usually know what's going on.
they had already like moved on just kind of naturally, I think,
Uh,
but I don't know. It, yeah, so it was super weird,
well, talk about an extreme observation.
right?
Ah,
One that I will never forget. And like as I like to be safe in the field. Like I hope that I'd never time that quite right like that again
no,
to
but
be
it's an awesome
underwater
experience.
during
Come
the
on.
earthquake. Yeah.
It would be very interesting to know if sea turtles actually move away from the shore to avoid tsunami like, you know, damage.
Yeah. I don't
Ah,
know.
interesting.
We have some evidence that like in South Florida here where I live now that
Hmm.
the sharks from the tagging data, it seems like they move deeper into deeper water when there's a hurricane coming. So
Okay.
um I'm sure other animals have their own ways of doing their thing to make
Ah,
sure they're not stuck in a bad situation.
yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I was looking for that turtle. I'm like, is anyone else still around or is just us idiots in the water? Like,
Only fools and horses. Yeah. Wow.
exactly. Um, but that was, I think, one of my most memorable days kind of outside
I
in the
get,
field.
I,
I'm
yeah.
gonna share my next story with you, which is
Okay.
actually something
Please.
that is um probably something way more people have experienced, but it
Hmm.
was a really amazing opportunity for me.
Okay.
So this next story happens in the Bahamas,
Ooh.
which is really close to where I live again here in
Nobody's
South.
feeling sorry for you with these stories, by the way,
I
right?
know.
You understand that, right?
I know. I know. Like I said, I have been very lucky to be able to look at animals and dive a bunch of places and I got to live and hike in northern Arizona where we have the Grand Canyon.
Mm,
Um, so I've
beautiful
gotten to
landscape.
work in a
Yeah.
lot of really beautiful places and take advantage of being outside and making those observations. But yeah, so this next story happens in the Bahamas. And the Bahamas is a really amazing place. Again, it's close to where I live in South Florida. So
Hmm.
it's someplace that's not super difficult for me to get to. Um, and as a government and as a people, the Bahamas have been really proactive about conservation. So they have a lot of policies and rules in place. So it is an amazing place to visit and look at wildlife, especially for scuba diving. And they have places like Tiger Beach and near Tiger Beach where there are really great, relatively shallow reefs that you can
Okay.
dive on and see some of these amazing big sharks swim through. And so that's what happens in my next story. Again, I'm scuba diving
Uh-huh.
and they were telling us on the boat, like, okay, you might see some big sharks. I'm like, cool, that's why I'm here. Love
Yeah.
to see them.
This is why
And
the beach is called Tiger Beach,
yeah, it's
presumably.
it's not it's like actually pretty far out, but it's a shallow area.
Uh-huh.
And they call it Tiger Beach because it's really sandy and
Uh,
there are a lot of tiger sharks there.
wow. Okay.
I think that's why they call it, that's why I call it that.
Probably
I don't
not
know
because
why
there are
other people
tigers there,
call it.
because there aren't any.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's not
yeah.
tigers swimming around. They're the sharks. Although if there was a tiger swimming around, that would be truly amazing.
That would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we were on the dive boat getting ready to go
Hmm.
in the water, and they say, like, basically, try to descend as safely as you can. So you're not just out there floating in the water column as, some of these big creatures could swim by because you want to, be a stable scuba diver near the bottom
Mm,
because it's pretty shallow. You don't want to just be floating up there,
sure.
looking weird and interesting to them. And so I'm like, okay, we're hopping in, we're descending as quickly as we can safely do. So I'm being a good scuba diver and clearing my ears and descending as safely as I can.
Sure.
So I'm descending, and in the distance, I see this very large, even in the distance, shark swimming towards us. And I'm like, I
Oh.
need to descend as fast as I can safely descend. And so the shark is like getting closer and closer, and I'm like descending. And apparently, my eyes were incredibly large as this thing was swimming towards me, and I was going down. And like I'm going down, the shark's like swimming by, and it
Yeah.
just like swims by. It was totally fine,
Yeah.
but it was very close. And I was apparently my eyes were so big, so the dive master always wanting to make sure everybody's okay. It's like, you're okay, and I'm like, I'm okay. No, I'm okay.
You just
And
described a nightmare for a lot of people, I think.
I'm sure. Well, everything was fine. It's a beautiful close encounter, like a beautiful encounter. It swam by. I kept descending.
Mm-hmm.
Everything happened the way it was supposed to. My dive buddy was like, "You okay? Do you still have air?" And I'm still here. Didn't suck it all down when I was seeing the shark so close. And then we were just kind of swimming around the reef, diving around the reef, exploring. But what was
Mm,
really incredible about this is um this, I assume it was the same shark, sort of
mhm.
hung around for much of the
Ah.
dive. And so we got to see it a whole bunch of times, and it definitely swam pretty close to us several times. We got some amazing pictures of this shark, and it was, when I say it swam by very close, it was like I probably could have touched it if I
Ooh.
wanted to. But just keep your hands to yourself. The shark will keep its fins to itself. We'll like, they'll swim by. I'll
Yeah.
watch. And from what we know about shark behavior, these sort of things should be
Mhm.
fine.
Just
And
curiosity,
so,
probably, or in your
yeah, like,
experience.
um, there's a lot of tourism. Like, I
Mm,
don't know if the shark was habituated or if it was just, I happened to be on the same reef it wanted to visit. It could
mm.
be any number of things. I can't, attribute whatever to the shark, but I was there to dive. So I was diving, being, shark safe as I could, but we were able to have this dive with this incredibly large tiger shark.
And what is
So
incredibly large? I mean, just to augment our imaginations here.
this thing was probably close to like 3 or 4 meters. Like
Yeah.
it was much bigger. I am like what, 64 inches tall, whatever, like meter and a half, meter and 3/4.
Uh,
Like it was a lot bigger. than,
yeah, and underwater things are so fast, much
yeah,
faster and agile
right.
than us. I mean, it's everything becomes impressive for
Right.
me at least.
It
Yeah.
was this really amazing opportunity to see it swim by.
Hmm.
Um, they have beautiful coloring, so we got
Mm,
to look at it up close as it went by. Um, and they are so graceful. Like
yeah.
you see them swim, and like you said, they move so fast. They make zero effort
Mm.
to, and we were scuba diving, so we had neutral buoyancy, so we were like closer to the bottom but up in the water, so we were pretty floaty and graceful, as a human can be underwater at that point. But yeah, so the shark was able to just kind of swim by. We spent our whole dive underwater, and what was really incredible is I think that is probably 100% the largest shark I have ever been diving with that I saw. There's quite
Hmm.
possibly I may not have seen other creatures I've been in the water with. Um, but it was probably the closest and the biggest shark
That's
I've ever
gorgeous.
been
Yeah.
in the water with. And it was just really big, it was really graceful, it was beautifully colored, and kind of just swimming around doing its thing like,
Mm,
this is my ocean,
yeah.
welcome.
That
So
must that really must be burned in your memory to have a big shark like that.
yeah,
Who
we
were you
got some
diving with at
pictures.
the time? Was it that also experienced shark people or people who might be a little bit more intimidated by the experience?
Well, my dive buddy was a pretty experienced diver, and then we had the dive master from the boat. So the
Mm,
people who run the boat charters are always really well experienced in those areas. And
yeah.
so, I mean, that's the nice thing, right? A lot of times when you go out and have these experiences, especially if you're diving from a boat, you're with people who have a lot of experience in the area. They know where the dive sites are. They know
Hmm.
um, like they know a lot about the environment just because they spend every day, like all day out there. So, if you've ever been almost anywhere in the world and you have a guide to take you on a hike or to a site, like
Yeah.
these are people who have just such incredible knowledge of the natural history of the areas they work in. They know exactly where to go and what they're doing. So, it's like really nice, obviously, as a scientist, to be able to work with people who have like such immense natural
Sure.
history knowledge in general. But yeah, I feel like all the dive boats, like they know where they're going, they do it all the time, so they've got a really good idea of what all the sites look like. and
Well,
and even
you're no
who hangs
slouch
out
either,
there.
and it's nice to hear that somebody who has seen as many sharks as you have, and sharks and rays and all those
Yeah.
amazing animals you work on, that seeing a shark like this can still absolutely make your day, month, year.
Oh, it was so memorable. But yeah, literally every time I go diving, I get excited by the smallest seahorse, the
Mm.
biggest stingray, like anything. Like I said, the ocean is full of a million things to study and observe and just enjoy. So,
And of those
um,
million things, are there things that you still want to see?
oh, well, so we just did this thresher shark paper.
Yeah, I love fresher sharks. They're just the most elegant looking things ever. Yeah.
I mean, they're a little goofy looking. They've got like these little bodies relative to their tail and these
Yeah, it's
giant
so
eyes
cool.
sometimes.
It's like
But
they're
like, yeah,
yeah,
they are elegant. They're graceful.
yeah.
And they have that big tail whip, which is a pretty graceful movement. Um, but I've seen videos. YouTube is an amazing resource for natural history, by the way.
I know.
You can get so much great information. Um, I've seen thresher sharks swim. I've seen them whip their tails, like that's in the literature,
Hmm.
the scientific literature. But I personally have never seen one. So after
Ah,
spending some time studying their skeletons and thinking about, the the functional morphology, like how does their anatomy enable them to do any sort of activity or motion.
Hmm.
I would really love to see one of those in the
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah, that
Um,
would be nice.
I have a real love of the mako shark.
Ah.
They have very pointy noses. I've been able to dissect specimens that have washed up and stuff. So they are
Mm.
shaped like torpedoes. They have
Yeah.
noses that come to like a perfect point. They're like a perfect fast swimming torpedo. And I would love to maybe not be in the water with one because it might be harder to watch it swim as it
Mm.
zooms past you. But I would love to be like on a boat, like being able to see one swim past. Or some of these big sharks breach and some big rays, like manta
Yeah.
rays do. And so seeing a breaching event would be really exciting. We have seen some like smaller sharks jump out of the water, and
Okay.
at the beach
Okay.
here in
Really. Yeah.
Florida, my son saw a manta ray jump out of the water.
Oh,
I heard like we heard it, but he
yeah.
saw it. He was like, now that manta just jumped. Like, what? And I missed it.
Wow.
But that's
And these are the things you see on natural history documentaries. And just to
right.
show that somebody who's worked on it all her life
Yeah.
has not seen that. So just the value of observations like that.
Yeah, the
Huge.
like I said, YouTube is amazing. Those
Yeah.
natural history documentaries, like the photographers and videographers who get to go out and collect that information is just so valuable to
Mm.
share, like scientifically, like what we
Hmm.
know some of these animals can do, but also just to like get the general public excited and interesting. Like, how does a manta ray launch its giant floppy body out of the water like that? That is
Yeah.
like a pretty amazing sort of biomechanical event, right? Like, how does that happen? And
They seem to have so
mako
much
sharks,
drag, right, on their big
right?
flat body.
There's just floppy
Yeah.
too. Like, and then we've got things like the mako sharks that are the fastest swimming sharks that we know of. And, I've been able to study them since the very beginning of my dissertation. And I've always wanted to be able to do something with my data where I can say, this is why a mako shark swims so fast.
Yeah.
But
Well,
it's
they're
always worked.
partially warm-blooded, right? Or at least
Yeah,
they have
they've got
a
that
warm body
regional
core.
endothermy.
Yeah, yeah.
So that helps them swim so fast. But like, in terms of their skeleton and muscle anatomy, like how do you, because when you, like I've said, I've gotten to dissect some of these guys who have washed up or been incidental mortalities. Their entire body is really stiff. It's not just very pointed and torpedo like it is solid and stiff, like it doesn't bend. And so you
Yeah.
think like if you pick up another, like if you go to the grocery store and get a fish that you're going to eat for dinner, if you like pick up the head, most of them their body's going to like flop over, like
Yeah.
their fish are just floppy, right? um and the same is true of most sharks, but makos are just like so rigid
Huh.
that I am always trying to use my research on their vertebral columns and their materials to sort of say, this is why they're so rigid and that's why they can swim so fast. But
Yeah.
most of the angles I've taken to kind of show that, they've actually been like less stiff or less impressive than the skeletons of other sharks. So I'm still trying to figure out
Mm.
what about their skeleton is the thing that makes it so stiff.
Drives you
I've
nuts,
I've got
right?
some. What's that?
It drives you nuts to have a question like that. I have something similar with my scorpions. I've been at it for 15 years. Uh,
I've got a new working hypothesis and a
okay.
brand new PhD student who started this fall. And
Hmm.
I told him what his first project's going to be. I'm like, here are some of these makos, and this is what I want you to do with them.
Uh-huh.
And so, um, I was just telling someone that the nice thing about my research is I can be out in the field and using drones and videos to get videos of animals doing what they do in the ocean. We're in
Hmm.
South Florida, so we're ideally located to do that with some really amazing species. Um, my research also lends itself to bringing animals into the lab, not giant animals like a big mako or a full-size manta ray, but smaller species into the lab to sort of study how they swim. And then anytime I have a dead fish that someone sends me, they can say, "Hey, do you want the vertebrae from whatever that just washed up?" And I can say, "Yes, please send it to here's my address." And so I
Hmm.
get coolers full of dead fish that nobody else wants, and then it's a lot of research for me. So um
And it's
I get,
fantastic research. I'm a very big fan of your lab
oh,
and your
thanks.
work. Come on, it's awesome. Even if you're
It's
not
pretty fun.
making putting laser beams on their heads, I love the material properties of the skin and the bone and the cartilage. And
Squishing and stretching stuff is so fun and informative.
that's a good summary. So
Yeah,
if
right?
people want to know more about your lab or they want to follow you online, are you on some social media platforms that we can announce here?
That's a great question. I am on Blue Sky. I do not remember. I used to be very active on Twitter when it was
Okay.
Twitter. My use has sort of fallen off. You can find me on Blue Sky at Marianne Porter,
Okay.
and Twitter, I think is the same thing. I
Marianne
don't
Porter.
check that
I'll
very
I'll put
often.
something on the screen. Don't
Yeah.
worry. We'll find it
I
and I'll put it
also
on screen.
have Yeah, I also have my lab's website, which is just meporterbiomechanics.com. So
Yes.
really pretty easy. I think it's pretty Googleable too to find me.
Yes.
And then yeah, you can always find me through the university websites as well at Florida Atlantic University. But yeah, we've got a great group of students working in my lab right now, and we just had our Thresher Shark paper come out earlier this year, which was
Mm,
really exciting for my PhD student Jamie is one of her first big dissertation chapters to get published. And then
mhm,
yeah, we've got a good group of students doing everything from sort of how fast sharks work, how do the skeletons of cetaceans work. So
ooh,
those are our marine mammals. And
yeah.
what is interesting about them that I really love is um, as humans, we always hear that we want to keep our skeletons strong, especially as we get older, right? You want
Hmm.
to make sure you're lifting weights and doing weight bearing exercises and taking your calcium supplements. And so, my question with the marine mammals is what do you do if you're a dolphin and you don't do weight bearing exercises?
Yeah.
Than that, in Florida, we have a critter called a manatee.
Mm,
A manatee, also sometimes called sea cows, they literally just like float around and eat seagrass.
yeah.
They're definitely not what anyone would consider active. And so, how do they keep their skeletons strong? Because they're floating around in water all the time. They're not loading their skeletons under gravity like we
Hmm.
do. Probably not lifting weights. I don't know for sure, but I assume not. And right,
They don't look like they do. No.
no.
Mm,
And so we've got some questions about sort of what does the bone anatomy look like in some
mhm.
of those organisms, especially related to their terrestrial counterparts or close relatives.
That would be very
Um,
interesting. Yeah. Do manatees get osteoporosis? Yeah.
like, what happens if you just float in water and that's your
Yeah.
life?
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that's relevant also for astronauts and things like that, right? Yeah.
that is like one of my big goals is I hope
Mm.
someday that like NASA or like some space agency is going to be like, your research is fascinating. Would you like to come see our space shuttles? So I can say, yes, I would love
Yes.
to. Not from the inside. That might be too scary for me.
Oh,
I accidentally dive during an earthquake. I will dive with the tiger shark, but going into actual space might be a little bit too scary for me personally.
yeah, you
But
can just send your robots up there. That's fine.
yeah, yeah. I will gladly look at all the cool technology they have. Um,
Yeah, awesome.
but yeah, look but not touch. Important.
Exactly. Well, you're doing awesome stuff, and I'll definitely keep following it. And I hope everybody who listens
Sure.
to this have a look at her lab because Marianne and her students do fantastic work, really interesting papers. So
Yeah,
with
we have a
that,
lot of fun.
yeah, thank you very much, Marianne, for your
Well,
great
thank you for
stories.
having me. It was amazing to catch up with you. We'll have to talk more about you in the next one.
Oh dear. Well, all right, we'll try that.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Marianne.
All
Bye-bye.
right, thank you. Have a great day.